He hired her to take care of his daughter, not to heal his heart. After his wife walked out and left him with their 3-year-old child, Richard Hills swore off love. Work was his escape. Silence was his comfort. And Grace Bennett, the quiet new nanny, was just another part of the structure he desperately clung to. Until one night he opened the wrong door and saw her. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The house was too quiet. Richard Hills stood in the doorway of his daughter's room, watching her sleep. Her little chest rose and fell in a soft rhythm. Tiny hands curled near her cheeks, one thumb slightly damp from a late-night suckle she never quite outgrew. The nightlight cast a soft glow across the room, illuminating scattered picture books and the tail of a plush giraffe peeking from under the bed. He took a step back and gently closed the door, pausing as the latch clicked into place. The silence on the other side of the door was suffocating. Down the hall, portraits of a family that no longer existed lined the walls. Richard, smiling, back when he smiled easily, holding his baby daughter. His wife, Camille, radiant and elegant, standing beside him. A picture-perfect life that had cracked at the seams just 2 years after Lila was born. She had left on a Thursday. He remembered because the morning had been normal. Cereal spilled on the counter, emails pinging, Lila's giggles echoing from the playroom. Camille had kissed their daughter goodbye, told Richard they needed to talk, and by evening she was gone. A suitcase, a short letter, and a final glance that held no regret. She had found her freedom in a life without them. And now, every room in the mansion echoed with the consequences. Richard moved through the kitchen, the motion-activated lights flicking on one by one. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, not because he needed it, but because the act of doing something made him feel less idle. The burn as it hit his throat grounded him, temporarily. He hadn't dated since she left. Not out of principle, but because the idea exhausted him. The thought of navigating small talk, pretending to care about meaningless pleasantries, or worse, risking another hollow relationship, felt unbearable. So he turned to what he knew, work. His software company thrived under his obsession with control and routine. He liked systems, he liked schedules, and most of all, he liked certainty, things that didn't leave in the middle of the day. But there was one variable he hadn't mastered: childcare. Lila's last nanny, a sweet older woman named Janet, had resigned unexpectedly after her husband's health took a sharp turn. She had stayed long enough to help train the temp agency's backup, who lasted all of 6 days before she tearfully admitted she couldn't handle kids full-time. Richard sat down at the long marble island, pulled out his tablet, and opened the folder labeled Nanny Applications. His assistant had vetted the top 5. He scanned resumes quickly: early childhood education, CPR certified, bilingual. All impressive, but nothing stood out. He wanted someone experienced, stable, invisible, even. Someone who wouldn't disrupt the fragile ecosystem of his house. The next morning, he interviewed 3 candidates in the library. The first was overqualified and overly chatty. The second made passive remarks about the house's size and decor, Camille's choices, which instantly rubbed Richard the wrong way. The third arrived 10 minutes early, quietly handed him a portfolio, and waited patiently until he offered her a seat. Her name was Grace Bennett. She was calm without being cold, direct without being stiff. She answered his questions with thoughtful clarity. When he asked why she wanted the job, she simply said, "Because I care about children, and I need the work. I don't overstep, I don't gossip, and I never bring drama to the door." He appreciated the honesty. There was no sales pitch, just a presence that felt still. After the interview, Lila wandered into the room with a crayon in her hand and a smear of yogurt on her face. Grace knelt down, smiled warmly, and said, "That's a very important drawing. Can you tell me what it is?" Lila lit up. By the time the little girl was perched on Grace's lap, describing a mermaid puppy, Richard had already made up his mind. She started the next day. Richard didn't explain much. He didn't give her a grand tour or warn her about the ghosts of memories scattered throughout the house. He simply handed her a set of keys, showed her Lila's routine chart, and said, "If she's happy, I'm happy." And that was the beginning. Grace moved through the house like a shadow, efficient, quiet, gentle. Meals were on time. Lila's tantrums became fewer. There was laughter at the dinner table again, even if Richard wasn't always part of it. He didn't know what perfume she wore, or if she wore any at all. He didn't notice the way her eyes lit up when Lila sang. He didn't look when she passed by in the hallway, or when she curled up on the floor reading bedtime stories. To him, she was the nanny. Professional, distant, invisible, just the way he wanted. Until one night, morning sunlight filtered through the oversized windows of the Hills estate, casting pale gold across the kitchen's sleek countertops and untouched bar stools. The home was pristine, polished, immaculate, a museum of what once had been a family. But now something small was shifting. Richard sat at the end of the breakfast table, half distracted by the glowing screen of his tablet. His coffee had long gone cold. Across the table, Lila was smearing blueberry jam across a triangle of toast, her fingers sticky and her cheeks smudged. She was talking to her stuffed rabbit in a low whisper, explaining the importance of breakfast energy. Grace moved through the kitchen behind them like a soft breeze. Barefoot, hair tied back in a low bun, she poured another glass of orange juice and placed it beside Lila without interrupting her conversation. She didn't make noise. She didn't ask questions. She simply was. Richard looked up just as Grace gently tucked a napkin into Lila's collar. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a polite nod, professional, expressionless, and turned away before he could say anything. He cleared his throat. She slept well. Grace paused by the sink. Took a little longer to fall asleep, but no nightmares. She's had them less often since recently, he murmured, eyes drifting back to the screen, though he wasn't reading anything. Grace said nothing. She dried her hands with a dish towel and moved on to wiping down the counters. There was never any small talk between them. It wasn't discouraged, it simply never started. Richard preferred it that way. Conversations led to familiarity, and familiarity led to complications. He had learned that the hard way. By the time he left for his office that morning, a custom-built suite across the property in a separate building, Lila was chasing bubbles on the lawn, squealing with delight. Grace stood nearby, blowing a few at a time, her long cardigan catching the breeze. Richard paused before entering the path toward the office, watching them for a beat longer than necessary. Lila's laughter echoed in the crisp morning air. Something twisted in his chest, a quiet ache he didn't quite understand. He turned away and told himself it was relief. That she was cared for. That he had done the right thing. The days slipped into a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast and giggles. Afternoons were filled with drawing, puzzles, and walks around the garden. Evenings brought storybooks and lullabies Richard never heard. Grace never overstepped. She rarely lingered in the same room with Richard unless it involved handing off information. What Lila ate, how much she napped, if she said something cute worth noting. Always brief, always calm, always just enough. Richard began to rely on her without realizing it. When a meeting ran late, she adjusted bedtime. When Lila got a fever, she stayed up through the night with cold compresses and children's Tylenol. When he forgot it was Lila's half-birthday, a big deal in the toddler world, Grace baked cupcakes shaped like stars and turned the kitchen into a galaxy with paper decorations. He walked into the house that evening, exhausted from an investor call, only to find the dining room filled with fairy lights and the sound of his daughter screaming. "I'm 3.5." She was wearing a tiara made of glitter foam. Grace stood behind her, cheeks dusted with flour, holding a spatula like a sword. Richard stared for a moment, caught off guard. "You did all this?" Grace shrugged, brushing flour from her sleeve. She said it was an important day. "I didn't even remember." Grace smiled gently, not unkindly. "That's why I did." For the first time, he felt it, a subtle shift. Not a door opening, not quite. But a window cracked just slightly. One night, Just after Lila had gone to bed, Richard walked into the living room to find Grace folding blankets on the couch. She had stayed late, something about a sore throat Lila developed earlier in the day. "You could have left," Richard said, hovering by the doorway. "She asked me to sing to her again," Grace replied. "It helped her fall asleep." Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure what he meant to say next. Something about how grateful he was. How the house felt, less suffocating with her in it. But the words felt too heavy in his mouth. Instead, he nodded toward the stairs. "I can take it from here." Grace folded the last blanket, placed it neatly on the cushion, and nodded. "Of course. Good night, Mr. Hills." He watched her walk out the door, quiet, composed as always. But for the first time, he noticed the curve of her neck as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The slight crease in her brow she always had when deep in thought. The soft hum she made when she was focused, like when she chopped vegetables or organized Lila's books by theme. He wasn't supposed to notice. That wasn't the agreement, not in his head, not in the lines he had drawn for his life. She was the nanny. She was invisible. And yet lately she wasn't. The house was darker than usual when Richard came home. He stepped in quietly, the click of the front door's latch echoing in the stillness. It was well past 10, later than he intended, but the investor dinner had dragged on, and he'd spent the final hour nodding at conversations that no longer interested him. He hadn't touched his glass of wine. Every time he thought of Lila curled up in bed without a goodnight kiss, a guilt-ridden pull tightened in his chest. He loosened his tie as he moved down the hallway, the low hum of the air conditioner the only sound greeting him. The house always felt vast at night. Too many rooms, too many untouched corners, and too much quiet for a man who once shared it with a wife and dreams that never came to pass. The nanny's room had been set up in the east wing, away from his, next to Lila's. It was an old guest suite with its own bathroom. Nothing lavish, but comfortable. She wasn't supposed to stay overnight unless needed. But with Lila running a low-grade fever the day before, Grace had offered to keep close. Richard hadn't argued. He moved through the hallway, shoes in hand now to soften his steps. Light flickered under one of the doors. He frowned. Lila's nightlight usually cast a soft orange, but this was different, more of a pale yellow warmer. He reached for the door without thinking, expecting to check on his daughter. He turned the knob and stepped in, then froze. It wasn't Lila's room. It was hers, and she was in the middle of changing. Grace stood with her back to him, her long cardigan draped over the chair, one leg raised as she pulled a pair of soft sleep shorts up her thighs. She was wearing only a bra and panties, delicate, cream-colored, modest, but intimate in a way that caught Richard off guard. Her skin glowed in the lamplight. She looked real. Soft. Human. Not just the nanny. His eyes locked on the curve of her waist, the gentle line of her back, the arch of her foot as she shifted her weight. It was only a few seconds, maybe 2, maybe 3, but time felt like it unraveled. He didn't move. He couldn't. Then she turned, half expecting to grab a t-shirt from the dresser, and her breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Hills." Her voice was hushed, laced with disbelief. Richard snapped out of it. I'm sorry," he stammered, stepping back immediately, eyes averted, voice thick. I thought this was Lila's room." She grabbed the cardigan and held it to her chest. "It's okay," she said quickly, though the blush on her cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. "It's fine. Really." He was already halfway out the door. "I didn't mean to intrude. Good night." Then he was gone. Grace stood there for a moment, heart racing, the cardigan still clutched tightly to her front. She could hear the faint echo of his retreating steps down the hall, the quick, heavy fall of feet belonging to a man who'd just shattered an invisible wall he never meant to touch. She turned to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, messy bun falling loose, bra strap twisted slightly, skin flushed from more than just embarrassment. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. He had looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time since she stepped into this house, she realized he didn't just see her as the nanny. Richard didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows on the plaster shifting as clouds moved past the windows. He had replayed the scene 100 times. The way she looked in that soft light. The way his gaze lingered involuntarily, helplessly. The way he felt like something had cracked open in him. Something he thought had long since closed. He wasn't supposed to notice her. He had made that very clear, not to her, but to himself. No distractions. No complications. Grace was here for one reason, Lila. Nothing else. But that night, he didn't see her as the employee. He didn't see the tidy ponytail, the routine, the reports she gave him in the evenings. He saw her body. And more unsettling than that, he saw her as a woman. He closed his eyes and exhaled, running a hand over his face. The air in his bedroom felt too hot. He kicked the blanket off his legs. Still restless. Guilt twisted in his stomach. But beneath that, something else simmered, something slower, deeper, uninvited. Curiosity. The next morning, he entered the kitchen later than usual, deliberately avoiding the earlier rush. Lila was already halfway through her oatmeal, babbling about a dream filled with talking cupcakes. Grace stood at the stove, back to him again, this time fully dressed in her usual understated style. Soft blue jeans, an oversized white sweater, and socks with tiny daisies printed on them. He swallowed. "Morning," she said over her shoulder without turning around. He stood awkwardly near the counter. "Morning." No mention of last night. No shift in tone. No trace of discomfort in her voice. But when she turned around to place a cup of coffee on the island, their eyes met. Just for a second. And that second carried weight. Neither of them said anything. But something had changed. Something neither of them could name just yet, and neither dared acknowledge. Days passed. And yet that night, the wrong door, the accidental intimacy, the undeniable shift, hung in the space between them like a mist. Thin enough to walk through. Thick enough to feel. Neither of them spoke of it. But both of them thought about it. Richard noticed her more. Not in the way he used to notice women at fundraisers or high-end events, with surface-level admiration and half-hearted flirtation. No, this was quieter. Involuntary. He noticed the way Grace tucked a lock of hair behind her ear when she read bedtime stories. The way she smiled, not widely, but just enough that the corner of her mouth dimpled. The way she rolled up the sleeves of her cardigan while cooking, her forearms slender, her movements methodical, precise, almost soothing. There was a softness to her that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He kept his distance. He made sure to be busy. Longer hours in the office. More virtual meetings than necessary. But even with the physical space, he felt her presence in the house as if it were woven into the walls now. Her humming from the playroom. Her laugh when Lila told a silly story. Her scent, a mix of laundry soap and something subtly floral, lingering after she passed. It unnerved him. And yet, he didn't want it to stop. Grace felt it too. The way he looked at her now wasn't the same. It wasn't impolite or lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. It was measured, curious, almost cautious. She felt her own awareness rising, against her will, against her better judgment. She started wearing looser sweaters, pulling her hair into tighter buns. She spoke more formally. She told herself it would help reestablish the boundary. She told herself it had been nothing, that he'd forgotten it already, that he didn't think of her like that. But then there were moments, like when she handed him Lila's art project and their fingers brushed. Like when he stood too close at the kitchen counter, not quite touching, but just near enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. Like when he watched her from the doorway one evening as she knelt beside Lila, tying her shoes with delicate fingers and a soft voice, and she looked up and caught him staring. He didn't look away. Neither did she. One night, a thunderstorm rolled over the hills. The sky cracked open, spilling rain in heavy sheets against the mansion's windows. Lila hated thunder. Grace stayed with her in bed, reading the same story over and over in a whisper while stroking her hair. Eventually, the little girl's breathing slowed, and she drifted off. Grace stood, careful not to creak the floorboards, and tiptoed out into the hallway. She hadn't turned the lights on. The house was dim, lit only by the occasional flicker of lightning in the windows. She didn't expect to find Richard standing there. He was at the end of the hallway, one hand resting lightly on the wall, eyes tired, shirt sleeves rolled up. His gaze was soft. "Storm wake her?" he asked, voice quiet. Grace nodded. "She's back to sleep now." Richard hesitated, then took a step forward. "You always know how to calm her," he said. "I don't think I ever really learned how." "You do fine," Grace replied. "She just needs different things from different people. From you, she wants to feel safe. From me, she wants the feeling of being small." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Being small? Small enough that the world isn't her problem yet," Grace said. "Just her dad and her nanny and a story before bed." A pause stretched between them. Richard looked at her then, not like the employer observing his employee. Not like the man who tried to avoid thinking too much. But like a man who hadn't allowed himself to see someone fully, and suddenly couldn't look away. "You're good with her," he said, his voice lower now. Grace's breath caught. Her pulse shifted. "I try to be," she answered softly. And then silence. Not awkward. Not strained. Just charged. The air around them felt thick, like it held weight, like it might carry something unspeakable if either of them dared to breathe too deeply. "Do you ever miss it?" Richard asked after a while. "Miss what?" "Having someone," he said. "Someone to share the quiet with." Grace looked down at her hands. Her fingers were clasped in front of her. She didn't answer right away. "Yes," she finally said. "But I think I miss being seen more than I miss being loved." Richard blinked. The words landed between them with too much honesty, too much vulnerability. He hadn't expected that answer. He hadn't expected it to feel so close to home. They stood there, both of them unsure whether they had crossed a line, or if the line had quietly vanished while they weren't paying attention. The next morning, the tension remained. Not uncomfortable, not inappropriate, but present, as if the house had a new occupant now, something unseen but alive, lurking just beneath every glance and pause. They didn't speak of it. They didn't touch. But everything had changed. The lake house had always been Richard's escape. Tucked behind a thin wall of pines, the glass and cedar structure sat on a gentle slope that rolled into the still waters below. It was only an hour outside the city, but it felt like another world, one where time slowed down and the pressures of meetings, mergers, and expectations slipped quietly into the background. He hadn't visited in nearly 2 years. Not since Camille. Not since the silence in the car on the way there became more unbearable than the silence in their bedroom. Not since they stopped holding hands. Not since she confessed she didn't love this version of her life, and maybe never really had. And now, for the first time since he had returned. Not alone. Lila squealed from the dock, arms flailing as she tried to skip a flat stone across the lake. "It bounced," she shouted, even though it clearly sank. Grace laughed beside her, kneeling down to hand her another rock. "Close enough, kiddo. Try this one, it's smoother." Richard watched them from the deck, coffee mug in hand. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall trees, painting the grass in golden slats of light. The air was crisp. Still, he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his daughter laugh this much. Or so freely. It wasn't the sugar rush kind of laughter that came from cartoons or toys. It was something deeper, joy that bloomed from security, from warmth. From her. Grace had been hesitant when he'd asked her to come. Just a long weekend. No obligations. A chance for Lila to get out of the house. He had told himself that was the reason. He repeated it enough that it almost felt true. But now, watching her in the sunlight, sleeves rolled up, feet bare, hair slightly undone in the breeze, he knew better. He didn't just want Lila to have the weekend. He wanted Grace there. That evening, after Lila fell asleep on the couch with a blanket over her and her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, Richard and Grace moved to the porch. They didn't say much at first. The stars were beginning to show, pinpricks of light against the indigo sky. The lake reflected them like a mirror, still and undisturbed. Grace curled her hands around a mug of tea, knees pulled up onto the cushion of the porch swing. She wore a soft flannel shirt over a tank top and leggings. Her hair was half down now, strands falling forward every time she shifted. Richard sat beside her, just far enough to be polite. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Grace smiled. "Thank you for inviting me. I wasn't sure if you would." "I wasn't sure either." They both chuckled softly. Then silence. But not the kind that needed filling. The kind that holds space. That asks for honesty. "I was afraid," she said suddenly. Richard turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Of what?" Grace looked out at the lake. "Of what this might mean. Of what I'm feeling. Of being wrong." Richard said nothing. His fingers tightened around the edge of his mug. "You're my boss," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this." He nodded once. "I know." Another pause. "But it is happening, isn't it?" she asked, turning to face him. Their eyes met. It was the first time either of them said it out loud. The first time the quiet energy that pulsed between them was given a name. "This." Richard's voice was low, rougher than he meant. "I think about you. More than I should. More than I'm proud of." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "I see you with her," he went on. "The way she looks at you. The way you've changed our home. I thought I could keep it professional. Just focus on Lila. On work." But then, he stopped himself. She didn't need him to say it. They both knew what then meant. The night of the wrong door. The night he saw her. The night she stopped being invisible. "I haven't stopped thinking about you since," he finished, more softly now. Grace swallowed. Her pulse raced. Her heart was loud in her chest. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Richard said. "But I don't want to ignore it anymore." A breeze passed between them. The swing creaked gently. Crickets hummed in the distance. He didn't move closer at first. He waited. Watched her. Her breath quickened, but her eyes didn't leave his. And then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. She closed her eyes at the touch. When she opened them again, the world felt smaller. Quieter. All that existed was him, her, and the air charged between their mouths. "Can I?" he asked. She nodded. The kiss was tentative at first, careful, questioning. His lips barely brushed hers, as if afraid the moment might shatter. But she leaned in, and then it deepened. Her hands slid up his chest, fingers grasping the fabric of his sweater. His hand curved gently around the back of her neck. Their lips moved in sync, exploring, learning, memorizing. It wasn't lust. Not yet. It was relief. Relief that the tension had a home now. Relief that something real was allowed to begin. When they pulled apart, foreheads still touching, eyes still closed, they both exhaled. Grace whispered, "What do we do now?" Richard smiled softly. "We breathe. We take it slow. And we don't pretend it didn't happen." She nodded. "Okay." He kissed her again, just once. Tender. Certain. And they sat like that for a while, side by side in the quiet, under the stars, with the lake holding their secret. The lake house felt different the next morning. Not visibly. Everything was still quiet, the scent of pine and fresh coffee drifting through the open windows. But the air had changed. Softer. Charged. Touched by something sacred and fragile. Richard woke early, earlier than usual, and lay still for a long time before getting out of bed. The kiss replayed in his mind like a loop that refused to end. Not just the kiss, the moment she leaned into it, trusted it. The way her eyes closed when he touched her. The way his name sounded in her whisper. He ran a hand over his face. He had crossed a line, and he didn't regret it. He stepped into the kitchen barefoot, mug in hand, only to find Grace already there. She stood by the stove in that same flannel shirt from the night before, sleeves rolled up, a faint crease on her cheek from sleep. She was whisking eggs in a bowl, brow furrowed slightly in thought. When she looked up and saw him, something unreadable passed between them. Hesitation? Warmth? The weight of knowing? "Morning," she said. He smiled. "Morning." That was all. No rush to redefine anything. No awkwardness. Just the shared knowledge of what had passed between them. and what had yet to come. But back in the city, the silence didn't hold. Reality didn't let them keep their quiet. It started small, subtle. One of the household staff, Mrs. Langley, the longtime housekeeper, noticed Grace's cardigan draped over the back of the armchair in the study. "I thought only Mr. Hills used that room," she said, folding it with just enough pause in her voice to carry meaning. Then came the sideways glance from Richard's personal assistant, when Grace brought Lila to the office for a visit and Richard happened to walk her out, hand lingering too long at the small of her back. It wasn't malicious, but it echoed. Grace felt it first. The eyes. The assumptions. She could see it in the way people hesitated around her now, smiling, but with a new tightness in the corners of their mouths. As if she'd gone from the invisible help to something else. Something they were trying to name, but didn't dare say aloud. One afternoon, while folding Lila's laundry upstairs, Grace heard voices drifting from the front entrance. The tone was unmistakable, clipped, sharp, feminine. She stepped onto the landing and froze. Camille. The ex-wife. Richard's ex-wife. She stood in the foyer in sleek heels and a tailored coat, sunglasses still perched on her head as though she hadn't decided whether she was staying long. Lila clung to Richard's leg, uncertain. Grace didn't move. She listened. "I didn't come to fight," Camille was saying. "I just wanted to see her. That's not a crime." Richard's voice was calm. "No one said it was. But next time, call first." "I thought I had some right to surprise my own child," Camille snapped. "She's not a prop in your guilt story," Richard replied flatly. Camille's eyes narrowed. "I saw her, your nanny. She was watching from upstairs like a watchdog. Interesting choice, by the way. Bit young, don't you think?" Richard didn't reply. Camille tilted her head. "Is she staying here? Or are you just sleeping with the help now?" Grace's stomach dropped. Even without seeing Richard's face, she could feel the silence that followed. Then his voice quiet, firm. "She's not the help, Camille. She's the one who held Lila every night you didn't call. She's the one who taught her how to say goodbye without crying. She's the one who stayed when you walked out." Camille's mouth twisted. "Sounds like you've replaced me nicely." "I didn't replace you," Richard said. "You left. There was nothing else." The door shut. Grace heard Camille's heels fading down the front steps. That night, Grace didn't join Richard downstairs. She stayed in her room. She didn't read. She didn't sleep. She sat in bed with the light off, knees drawn to her chest, heart heavy. She hadn't expected this to be easy. But she hadn't been prepared for the sudden weight of it. The whispers. The judgment. The fear that maybe Camille was right. She was the nanny. Was she anything more than that? Richard knocked gently on her door just past 11. "Grace." She hesitated, then pulled it open. He stood there, t-shirt and sweats, barefoot, eyes tired but kind. "You didn't come down." "I wasn't hungry," she lied. "I heard you folding laundry for 2 hours." She gave a soft, humorless smile. "Therapeutic." He nodded, then looked at her, really looked at her. "What happened earlier? What she said, don't let that crawl under your skin." "She's not wrong," Grace said quietly. "This looks exactly like what it shouldn't." "To who?" "To everyone." "I don't care about everyone." "Well, I do," Grace said, her voice rising for the first time. "I care how this makes you look. I care that I might be a complication for you. That people will think I'm just someone you hired and fell in love with," he said. She stopped. The hallway went still. "What?" Richard's voice didn't shake. "I'm not confused. I've never been clearer. This isn't just attraction. This isn't temporary. You matter to me, Grace. Not just because you take care of Lila. Because you changed the whole house without trying. You see me in a way no one else ever has." Her throat tightened. "I've been afraid too," he said. "But I'm not anymore. Not of the noise. Not of what people think." Grace blinked fast. "You shouldn't say things like that unless you mean them." "I don't say anything I don't mean." She stared at him. Her walls crumbled. And suddenly she stepped forward and buried her face in his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, one hand cradling the back of her head. There were no kisses that night. No heat. Just quiet. Just a long, silent embrace in a hallway that no longer separated them. The garden had never looked so alive. Grace stood near the old stone fountain, her fingers curled lightly around a small bouquet of white ranunculus and pale roses. Lush vines curled up the pergola, wild and natural, as though nature itself had approved of this day. Sunlight trickled through tall oaks overhead, casting golden lace across the path where the guests would walk. Only a handful of them had been invited. Family, a few close friends. Lila, of course, had been part of every conversation, even if she kept insisting she would be the boss of the wedding and threatened to wear her superhero cape with her flower girl dress. Grace smiled at the thought. She reached up, fingers trembling slightly, and touched the small pendant at her neck. It had once belonged to her mother. Simple, meaningful. She could still hear her mother's voice years ago whispering, "Love is never what you expect, but it's always what you choose." A soft voice came from behind. "You look beautiful." Grace turned. Richard stood there in a tailored gray suit, no tie, sleeves just slightly rolled at the wrist. As always, slightly underdone. He had never needed effort to command presence. But today, there was something else in his expression. Peace. Warmth. Love. She felt it before he said a word. "I wasn't sure I'd make it here," he said, voice low. "I mean, this place. This version of life. I couldn't picture it before. Not with anyone. Not after her." Grace walked toward him slowly. "But now you can," she asked. "I can't picture anything without you." He reached for her hand. She gave it without hesitation. The ceremony was small. Lila walked down the garden path with solemn duty, clutching her basket, every now and then tossing petals into the air with more enthusiasm than accuracy. She wore a white dress with silver glitter, a tiny crown on her head, and her superhero cape, because Grace had finally said yes to it. "She's marrying both of us," Lila had declared that morning. "So I have to look extra magical." When Grace walked down the aisle, escorted by no one, she held her head high. There was no need for someone to give her away. She was choosing this on her own. Richard stood beneath the arch of twisted ivy, waiting. No music. No formal procession. Just the sound of birds in the trees and the rustle of the breeze. And when Grace met his eyes, everything else melted. The officiant spoke gently but briefly. Neither of them wanted long speeches. What they had was already understood. It was Richard who insisted on writing their vows. Not because he liked tradition, but because this, he said, mattered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. His voice was steady as he began. "You came into our home without noise, without demands, without expectations. You didn't ask me to heal. You didn't ask me to move on. You just showed up and loved my daughter like she was your own. And eventually, you loved me when I forgot how to love myself. I never thought I would have this again. Not just family, but peace. Grace, you brought peace to my life. Not because it was easy, but because you stayed through what was hard. I vow to never stop choosing you, to never take your quiet strength for granted, and to love you in every version of our story." Grace's eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. When her turn came, she spoke softly, no paper, no script. "When I came into this house, I expected nothing more than a job. I had no plan to stay, no plan to belong. But Lila opened a door, and you let me walk through it. Even when you were scared. Even when I was scared. You've shown me that love can grow in silence, in trust, in shared morning coffee, and in long stares across the hallway when words felt too fragile. I vow to never forget what it took for us to find each other. And I vow to never stop being your home." For a moment, the garden held its breath. Then the officiant nodded. "You may kiss your wife." And Richard did. Gently, reverently, like a man who had waited years for this exact moment, and now knew exactly what it was worth. Later, after the cake had been cut and Lila had fallen asleep curled up under a blanket on the grass, still wearing her cape, Grace and Richard sat on the porch steps together. The stars were out. It reminded them of the lake house, of the porch swing, of the kiss that started everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He laced his fingers through hers. She said, "We're all married now," Grace murmured. Richard smiled. She's not wrong. They sat in the quiet, no longer afraid of it. No longer filling the silence. Just being. A man, a woman, a child, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. Not perfect, but real. And finally, theirs. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.